I hope that students are into some of the most radical thinking that's going on, most of which is probably anarchist, which is talking about alternatives to authoritarian government. But in fact, while all this goes on, the government actually becomes more and more and more and more authoritarian, and every year that passes increases the amount of control exercised by the government over individual people. And one of the things that used to distress me is that students were always begging for more in the way of surveillance. We want more cameras because the women are afraid of being attacked at night. We want more lights. We want more... I'd be going around with a pea shooter, getting rid of the lights so that we could have some darkness and some sanity. But it depends whether students feel deeply insecure, and I think they do. Usually what happens when jobs get harder to get is students get conservative and just want a job qualification. They certainly don't want to rock the boat. They don't want to develop revolutionary ideas. They just want to know that they won't starve to death. The sexual revolution has not begun. We are still in the prodromal stages. There's going to be a big struggle. And we don't even know quite what the struggle is going to be about, because we haven't finished or arrived at any consensus about what the problem actually is, of whether it's possible for men and women to treat each other decently. It doesn't look possible. You know, if you think that 2 women a week in this country are killed by their partner, you've got to think there's something terribly wrong. But of course, if you can say to somebody, get fucked, and mean it as an insult, then obviously your head's in a bad place where fucking is concerned. So how can we get the sadism out of it? How can we become potent rather than vicious? Do we know how to do this? Have we even begun to figure out why all we seem to be able to do to each other is hurt each other? I never wanted equality. I think it's a meaningless idea, nonsensical idea. I certainly don't want the life of an organisation man. I don't want the life of a corporate lawyer or a bond trader or even a diplomat or a parliamentarian, because you're simply recycling the same injustice and misery. So what I look forward to is a complete reversal of priorities, so that the things we take for granted as being trifling, like housekeeping, become major. For example, we need to housekeep this planet. We need to really bring in principles of domestic economy, that we're not behaving in a way which is depleting the resources of the planet, reducing its biodiversity, which is our real inheritance. Everything else is nonsense, all the great houses and silliness. Even the works of art are nothing compared to biodiversity. But in order for that to become so important that people will accept a fall in their standard of living and live in a more frugal and austere way, we've really got to have a completely different mindset. Consumerism's got to be as no-no as drinking and driving.
In the 47 years since you wrote The Female Eunuch, there's been a massively increased rate of women's participation in all facets of Western developed world. I heard you mentioning Theresa May in less than generous terms earlier, and my partner is absolutely certain, as is my older sister, that Hillary Clinton lost the election not because she was a bad candidate, but because she was a woman. So my question is a serious question, and it gives you the opportunity to look back over the last 47 years and tell us what you think has really changed for women and what hasn't changed for women in that period.
Look, it's a huge question, but let me simplify it in a way. What everybody has accepted is the idea of equality feminism. that women should earn the money that men earn. They're hypnotized by this question. And as far as I'm concerned, equality is a profoundly conservative aim. It will change nothing. We now live in a world where war is made against civilian populations, where it's women and children who are the principal casualties in places like Syria, whether they're being driven ahead of the storm or whether they're in collapsing buildings or bombed schools or all the rest of it. War is now completely made of the rich with their extraordinary killing machines destroying the poor who have no comeback. If women want to be in the army, women want to be in government, women want to be in the corporate world, they won't get to the top unless they're already organisation people. Mrs. Thatcher was the most warlike Prime Minister the English have ever had, and she is guilty and will remain guilty of a massive war crime, which she got away with. And war crimes are being committed every day by us, but we don't end up in court. Other people end up in court whom we can beat the crap out of. Women are drawing level with men in this profoundly destructive world that we live in. And as far as I'm concerned, it's the wrong way. We are getting nowhere. And to say we're going to have a female Prime Minister, apart from the fact that you should be aware that Theresa May got this job because whoever has it will never rule the country again. It's a traditional poison chalice. But Mrs. Thatcher had a poison chalice as well. They got her to do their dirty work, and when she'd done it, they slung her out like a piece of trash. She left Downing Street in tears. She must be the only Prime Minister who was ever reduced to that. As far as I'm concerned right now, we're getting nowhere. If we're going to change things, I think we're going to have to start creating a women's polity that is strong, that has its own ways of operating, that makes contact with civilians in places like Syria, that actually begins to show a network that challenges the right of destructive nations to bomb the crap out of people they don't agree with. Everything has to change. But we knew that at the beginning. If what happens when women join the army is that they discover that the army is no place for a sane human being, then they've learned something, and we can move on from there. But right now, things are looking distinctly grim.
I'd like to ask Germaine Greer whether she thinks that there's a relationship between the way sexuality and the relationship between men and women has evolved, namely that masculinity is based on dominance over women, power over women, ultimately violence over women, and the fact that our civilization has been one in which men have always striven to have power over other men, and this has led again to violence.
I think the whole problem is that we all realize, one way or another, that we've been ruled by force, and the world has been ruled by force as long as anyone can remember, and that if we are on the brink of a revolution, and it's that or death, then it must be that the only revolution which will exchange the rule of force for something else, for a more intricate and sophisticated social order built on some much more complicated interaction of faculties and people.
It's really difficult to think of a teacher these days who hasn't been exposed to feminism and hasn't absorbed some part of the feminist agenda. They're working women for a start. They're working in an industry that has been controlled historically by men, and also an industry in which the female-dominated part of the profession is very much inferior to the male-dominated, well, there's almost no part of teaching now that's male-dominated, but if you think that the primary school and preparatory school teachers are paid much less than teachers higher up the scale, this has got something to do with the fact that it's seen as a female domain. And I would hope that teachers are beginning to see that that's ridiculous, because elementary schooling is what everything else is based on. Get that right, get children used to learning and understanding that there's stuff to be found out there and it's fun doing it. Once you've done that, it's plain sailing, but that has to be done. Customers and clients, students come to university to buy something. What they're buying is knowledge. The commodification of knowledge. God, what a disgusting idea that is. It's horrible, isn't it? If it means anything good, it means that as a client or a customer, a student has a right to demand a certain level of service. And I would say that in many places where I have taught, students did not get that level of service. They were taught in a way that was palpably uninterested in them, because the people who taught them were busy working on their book or their whatever, and you went and knocked on their door and you were interrupting their train of thought. And you were not a part of their train of thought. You were an inconvenience. I taught at a university where, for example, the person who'd been hired to teach the 18th century literature wouldn't teach it because he was writing a book. And he said it was too difficult. Students couldn't do the 18th century. It required too much of them. So I said, okay, I'll teach it. Typical woman, I'll do it. And then, even more stupid, I said, I'm going to do 2 lectures a week instead of 1. That means 20 lectures instead of 10. And I want you to come to them. And I set out a whole map of the 18th century from the beginning to the end. And we had a great time doing it. And they were roaming off all over the place, reading Spenserian stanzas and Ossian, and I taught Mystics and Madmen, which was Clare and Blake and Christopher Smart. It's only 1 hour to teach 3 amazing lunatics, and the kids had a grand time with it and did very well in the exams. And there's a lot of that goes on. Well, if that means now, you know, that students can go and say, I'm not going to go to lectures if all I'm going to get is a lecture that was written 10 years ago, that he's just reading his old notes and doesn't make eye contact with anybody, doesn't understand where anybody's coming from. This is not good enough. If that's what it means, but I very much doubt that it does mean that. When The Female Eunuch was written, all I could think of was that I was going to see it on the remainder tables in Great Russell Street as I went past on my way to the British Museum to study, and that I would have embarrassed myself and everybody else because the book would be a total flop. And in fact, it nearly was a total flop because it was very badly published in England. But then the Americans got hold of it and the rest is history. I haven't changed my mind about anything in the book. I would change the emphasis now. I mean, then I was a 30-year-old heterosexual, sexually active woman who was still negotiating the rapids of sexual encounters and all that sort of thing. So I was more caught up in things about appearance and the dynamic of male-female interaction and so forth than I would be now. I mean, now I wrote another book called The Whole Woman, which deals with other things that I would probably think now are more important, like women's sorrow, women's grief, and what it's like to be steadily rejected by the people you've spent your whole life loving and serving, which is the fate of most elderly women. You know, you go into these facilities where old ladies are left to gently rot, and you sometimes wonder if what they're shouting is, fuck! Because they're so angry because they gave it their best shot and they got dumped. The one thing I really don't want the archive to be
is self-justification. You can make whatever judgment you want of the way I've behaved. Once I am no longer here, I am yours to reinterpret. And I can't control that, and I don't want to control it. I'm an old-fashioned libertarian, which means that I'm actually an anarchist. I do not believe in censorship of any kind. And that includes pornography and all the rest, which means that I've come up against other feminists in this regard. But we have been controlled by having our lips taped shut for generations. Why would I say tape somebody else's mouth shut? I want to hear your reality. I'll fight it if I must, but I won't ban it, and I won't silence you, and I won't want a safe place where I can say I can avoid being offended. I'm offended every day. The Sun newspaper offends me every day. The Guardian offends me even more because it is the world's most hypocritical of newspapers. It is the Sainsbury's of newspapers. It is just like all the other newspapers, but it pretends that it's something different, and that really gets up my nose. So I'm prepared. I mean, I think, let me tell you why I don't want to explain. I will never write an autobiography. My assistant keeps saying, because occasionally I give her a little tidbit to keep her going, and she will say, oh, you have to write a book, you have to write a book. And I say, no, the autobiography won't be written. I will never write it. And I was really upset for Doris Lessing, great writer, Nobel Prize winner, and her reaction when she was told was she said, oh, God. And I know that feeling absolutely, oh, God, you give me the one prize I didn't want. But that's life. But she capitulated to people who started to pressure her about her biography. She capitulated by writing one. Don't do it. A biography is always self-justifying. You are explaining yourself. And in a way, I suppose I do subscribe to that notion that says never apologise, never explain. Do what it is you have to do and hope that eventually someone will understand why you did it that way. But don't ask pardon and don't excuse yourself. And if you got it wrong, you got it wrong. Now, some of you may know, for example, that one day the Guardian rang me up and said, Steve Irwin's just been killed by a stingray, and are you upset? And I said, no. And they said, are you surprised? And I said, no. And they were offended. They said, why aren't you surprised and upset? And I said, because he had it coming. Oop. So I tried to explain that he treated animals without respect, that he created ridiculous fantasies about them having wicked intentions, being vicious and cruel, and that he was leading understanding of the natural world into an impasse, a ridiculous impasse. And I was kind of relieved, really, that the stingrays had been there to do the job. And the result of that was a huge drawer full of hate mail, which I think perhaps the archivists haven't found. But it was very interesting because people would come up to me in the street, and they'd come up and they'd go, I think you were quite right about Stephen. And I realised there's more than one kind of censorship, that people were afraid to say that he was an embarrassment. And then, of course, after at least 2 months, academe tiptoed into the limelight and said, well, we tend to think that maybe he had in some way... And they managed to say what I'd said 2 months before in words of 1 syllable. They managed to obfuscate in words of 25 syllables. But it came to the same thing in the end, and I think it's true to say that that way of dealing with native Australia, natural Australia, is no longer acceptable. That we no longer fantasise about the intentions of animals who we're harassing and corralling and sentencing to death in myriad dreadful ways. So the reason for the archive then is not to give a picture of me, but to try and give a picture of the moment. Because it would be encapsulated in all kinds of ways. It will have been described under various cliches, and people would have no way of knowing what it actually felt like at the time. I mean, when people write, when a mother writes a letter to me telling me what a slut her daughter has become because of my writing, that itself is interesting. It's interesting that the mother would be so disloyal to her own daughter. But then my job is to write back to her and say, is it any surprise to you that your daughter behaves the way she does when you're prepared to write to a total stranger in these terms? Now, those letters will turn up in time. The important thing about them, well, they're there, I know, but the important thing about them is not that I wrote them. That's not the issue about them. What is really important about them is the two different ways of thinking about things that are coming into sharp conflict at this point. There are all kinds of letters like that. The letters from ordinary people are more important to me than the letters from celebrities, of which there are very few, in fact.
Greer is a TERF, a trans-exclusionary radical feminist. She's a particularly vulgar and dehumanizing one at that. You know, some TERFs may couch their rhetoric in platitudes about not hating trans people, just, I don't know, loving women or care, I don't know, some such thing. But that is not Greer. She'll talk about men cutting their dicks off. And if you listen to her rhetoric, you'll see soon enough that it's not just hateful, but it kind of makes no sense. Like, where is she coming from? Sometimes she seems to say that trans women are men who are willing to take one for the team in a pretty extreme way. That is, that they are willing to undergo surgical transformation to erase women, to phase them out somehow, and keep them out of the halls of power by usurping them. Or maybe not. Maybe is it that they desire female subjugation? It's a sex thing? Or maybe that they do think they are women, but only because women are to them a non-gender. Oh wait, no, it's just that it isn't fair for people who have lived as a man and enjoyed some degree of male privilege to then transition because reasons? Honestly, it's rather hard to make heads or tails of these many contradictory ideas, which seem more like throwing shit at the wall and seeing what sticks than anything else. But then, prejudice is never about logic, and it sure as hell isn't about considering what the other is going through. An empathic person might say that, yes, a transgender woman might get some male privilege points prior to their transition, or prior to coming out, but at what cost? How much psychic pain, dysmorphia, and stigma from society might they have to deal with? And who the hell would want that? I'll take cis woman any day, regardless of its problems. Better to have to try to convince people of my worth as a woman than have to convince them that I am one. And in any case, what does fair have to do with anything? It's not fair you are a woman? What? And if you're wondering what she has to say about trans men, not a whole hell of a lot. She has also come out against things like abortion and contraception because they're male interventions in reproduction. But also, she considered IVF and only decided against it because she thought she was too old. So I guess that intervention is okay. She says speaking out against FGM, female genital mutilation, is an attack on cultural identity. And all these things make no sense in terms of her overall message of taking control of one's sexuality as a woman. Now let's talk about her book about how pretty boys are, shall we? Yay! Ugh. The Beautiful Boy featured a lot of pictures of teenage boys and was intended to advance women's reclamation of their capacity for and right to visual pleasure, which is creepy. Okay, let's not split hairs. It's freaking creepy. Also creepy was that she used the picture of actor Bjorn Anderson from when he was 15, and he didn't want her to. She cared nothing for exploiting his image, bringing up difficult memories that he had, or exploiting him for his looks, using him as an object of fetishistic visual pleasure against his consent. She didn't give a shit. This from a woman who said that nature had gotten revenge on Steve Irwin on the occasion of his death because he exploited nature in his documentaries. So, again, sometimes it's okay to exploit things and sometimes it's not, and it seems to depend on what's best for Greer. The book also has a quasi-defense of sex tourism, which is beyond any kind of pale in my... It's just no. Just no. Just fucking no. For fuck's sake, no. But look, let's face facts. This crap is all because she's a prejudiced asshole with a pronounced lack of empathy. She's just a smarter, better educated brand of shitlord. A reactionary troll with an academic pedigree. Has that come across yet? Has anyone... Have I made that clear that this is a pattern? There is nothing here that I'm talking about that's not pretty well known. Public record stuff. A lot of it you could probably get off of Wikipedia. And yet, there are people who think we need to keep platforming her and naming her Australian of the Year and shit. And this leads me to the current uproar around her comments on rape. Look, she said awful things about rape, sexual assault, and the Me Too movement before. For instance, calling women victimized by Harvey Weinstein career rapees and whatnot. But let's talk about the specific things that she said. And these have been widely reported, but in no particular order, and different outlets have reported different things. So, from a recent speech that she gave. So I'm just going to sort of read through different quotes that have been reported in different places. And then we'll talk about it. I want to turn the discourse about rape upside down. We are not getting anywhere approaching it down the tunnel of history. Centuries of writing and thinking about rape as inflicted by men on women have got us nowhere. Rape should be viewed as a lazy, careless, and insensitive act. Okay. Every time a man rolls over on his exhausted wife and insists on enjoying his conjugal rights, he is raping her. It will never end up in a court of law. Instead of thinking of rape as a spectacularly violent crime, and some rapes are, think about it as non-consensual. That is, bad sex. She says the penalty could be 200 hours of community service. If we're going to say, trust us, believe us, if we do say that our accusations should stand as evidence, then we have to reduce the tariff for rape. She also thinks, though, that the punishment could be an R tattooed on the rapist's hand, arm, or preferably cheek. Bad sex, where there is no communication, no tenderness, no mention of love. Most rapes don't involve any injury whatsoever. We are told that it's a sexually violent crime. An expert like Quentin Tarantino will tell us that when you use the word rape, you're talking about violence, a throwing them down. It's one of the most violent crimes in the world. Bullshit, Tarantino. Greer says the culture's ideas about rape make the experience more traumatic for women than it needs to be. Society wants women to believe that rape will destroy them. We haven't been destroyed. We've been bloody annoyed is what we've been. She cites a study that found that 70% of rape victims suffer post-traumatic stress disorder, compared with 20% of conflict veterans. What the hell are you saying? Something that leaves no sign, no injury, no nothing, is more damaging to a woman than seeing your best friend blown up by an IED is to a veteran. She also thinks that some rapes are violent, and in those cases the perpetrators should be punished more harshly, but it should be about the violence. She thinks that instead of long trials and debates about what happened behind closed doors, the idea is reducing the punishment for rape, but make it easier for women to get their claims through. It is moments like these, I could hear the feminists screaming at me, "You're trivializing rape." Well, I'll tell you what, you might want to believe that the penis is a lethal weapon and that all women live in fear of that lethal weapon. Well, that's bullshit. It's not true. We don't live in terror of the penis. A man can't kill you with his penis. And then she brought up her own personal experience again as a way of dissuading people from criticizing her and saying things like, well, the man that raped her said she should say fuck me a dozen times. I don't think I said it, but maybe I did. How would that look on my mobile phone in court saying fuck me? All right, so I think that's enough for us to tear apart. This is, again, not the only time she said inflammatory things about rape, but reading through these quotes, I find myself rather agreeing with one attendee to the talk who said it appears she's making shit up as she goes along, and that seems to be exactly what she's doing. Again, just like with her quote analysis of trans and non-binary people, which I think is utter bullshit. She's just saying it's just all nonsense, every bit of it. It's like, ugh. All right, so for instance, you could say, oh, rape and sexual assault are still a problem, and we haven't fixed it yet, even though we've been trying to. Well, yeah, I mean, isn't that exactly like every other social problem we're dealing with? Like, do we just give up? Let's not talk about poverty anymore. Obviously, we've talked about it before and done things before, and there are still poor people, so let's never worry about it again. Let's not talk about racism anymore. Racism has been a problem. Apparently, we're just fucked. Like, that's not how these things work. Also, her absurdity that women aren't afraid of penises. Yeah, we never said we were. We're not afraid of the penis. We don't want to be violated against our consent. We don't want other people taking our bodily autonomy away from us. We don't want to be forced to do sexual things we don't want to do. We want to be able to say no. That's what we want. That's what the woman in bed with a man wants. Is he going to roll over and demand his conjugal rights? Well, maybe that will end up in court, or maybe it won't. Maybe it's a matter of teaching people about the importance of consent. Maybe it's about getting rid of this idea that anybody has a conjugal right to anybody else's body. Maybe it's about tearing that page out of our society's book and not just giving up. Not that any of what she says makes sense. Our accusation will stand on evidence, whether or not we're talking about rape or mugging or any other crime. Testimonial evidence is evidence. The barriers that we talk about aren't necessarily barriers to the legal process so much as the ways that this is being handled, the rape kits that are allowed to languish, the sexist notions that women just run around lying about rape and sexual assault all the time. That's what we have to tackle. That's what we have to attack. That's the bullshit that we have to get through. To call non-consensual sex bad sex, it's not fucking sex. It's rape. And let's not... Oh, fucking Greer. Fucking Greer! All right, never mind. I don't care if there's tenderness or if somebody says, oh, I love you while they rape me. I care about the consent. That's what we're talking about. And sometimes she's saying that women can just brush off rape like it's yesterday's bad news, like an episode of Bad Weather. But then she talks about court proceedings as if they are going to be so incredibly traumatic we can't expect women to go through them. This is nonsense. It makes no sense. Look, rape sucks. Nobody wants to be raped and beaten. If you had to choose between the two, you would not want to take the savage beating as well as the rape. But ideally, those aren't your choices. The choices are just not to be raped or beaten, right? And that should that horrible thing happen to you, you should be able to go to the law enforcement and not have to deal with layers of sexism and denial that other people would not face. In similar he said, she said kinds of crimes like mugging. right? That's the whole point. Really, a lot of this is exactly the same kind of garbage argument that you get from rabid MRAs. Her bad sex is just bringing up Thunderfoot videos to me. It's all crap. It's not based in anything. She outright sees that the studies don't agree with her, that rape is in fact traumatic for people. Yeah, it's true that once upon a time, rape was considered more of a crime of property. That is to say, one man harmed or tainted another man's property, more so than it was considered a crime against the woman herself. And that sucks, and that has already, I think, changed a great deal in our culture, and needs to change more. We need to confront these ideas of rape victims being considered tainted or damaged goods. Right? So that's fine. And we can do that. And it's going to take a while. And it's not going to be easy. And there's going to be fighting. But and her acting like Quentin Tarantino is the one that's pushing this. Oh yeah, Quentin Tarantino. He's the world's leading rape expert. He's the one everybody goes to. Are you fucking kidding me? Just shut up, Greer. And I'm done. All right, I'm done.